The landscape of work, particularly over the past few years, has changed and continues to change dramatically for individuals, for organizations. The way that we communicate, working remotely and the policies around that, how we handle time zone differences. But where does, in this future of work conversation, where does well-being fit in? Well, I'm not an expert in that, but I talked with two people who are. I had recently had a conversation with Arosha Brouwer and Flo Alcasas. Arosha is the CEO of Quan, which is a company that's dedicated to promoting well-being and enhancing the quality of life for individuals and communities, particularly within organizations. Flo is the head of HR at Yoda One Games. A lot of interesting insights in this conversation that you won't want to miss. So, without further delay, here is my discussion with Arosha and Flo. So, welcome to both of you. Great to have you here. We're going to be talking about this wellness in especially the future of work. We're going to be talking a bit about remote work and how to handle some of those challenges. So it's great to be talking with both of you. Maybe we can start with the sort of big picture stuff, the trends and maybe some of the issues that have, for example, Arosha, that have made you think, hey, this is an issue really worth focusing on, right? So could we start with that, some emerging trends and challenges generally in remote work, and what organizations should be aware of in terms of kind of what's happening?
Maybe I'll start with, three trends that I tend to quote quite often, and then I'm sure Flo can build on that, especially from a remote angle. The number one that I like to start with is 82% of people have experienced burnout or a mental health issue at work over the last 2 years, right? And just like let that sink, 82%. And most people, when you say that, they kind of start nodding their heads because they can think of themselves or their colleagues or family and friends that have gone through it, right? So that's one. The second one is 1 in 3 people are actively looking for a job, a new job.
You mean to say not necessarily that they've quit and they're looking, but they're just generally looking, they want something else.
Indeed.
Okay.
And last year, there was this whole talk about the great attrition, the great awakening coming out of COVID. And so we're seeing the results of that, where people have had time to sort of evaluate, what am I doing? And is it what I want to do? There's a little bit of purpose alignment that's taken place. And when we talked about the future of work, we all knew that Gen Zs and millennials have a stronger need to work on things which are meaningful. We're seeing that when you look at the data and you're looking at what they value in workplaces. They're valuing the impact, they're valuing well-being. It's coming up constantly as top 3 in what they're looking for in an employer. But what COVID did was it sort of accelerated
So
the
it was
whole
a
move.
thing that was happening and then it just sort of pushed it along, made it more immediate.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Interesting.
I'll pause because I'm curious to hear what
Well,
Flo.
just as a quick follow-up question though, is that so it's very distinctly you called it the Great Awakening, not a blip. It's a big scale trend.
It's a big scale trend. I mean, all the data shows it. It's just that, for a long time, it was like Gen Zs and millennials, they demand more, they want more flexibility, they have more demands, they're just higher, what's the word? Higher maintenance, right? And then COVID came along, and it seems that they're not the only ones, right?
Right.
And so because everyone's gotten a taste of flexibility, everyone's gotten a taste of not having to work from the office 5 days a week, and everyone's kind of noticed that when COVID happened, some jobs were a little bit more useful than others. So people have had a moment to sort of think, And what is my contribution? And hang on, why
Interesting.
am I doing
Yeah.
this?
Right. That's very interesting, and it's good. It's interesting to know that the data supports that as well, because I think a lot of people feel that sort of intuitively, but may not have the data to back it up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that ties then very naturally into the importance of wellness, which I know that you're very focused on, or well-being rather, excuse me, well-being that I know you're very focused on. So those two words sometimes get mixed up inside my head, so I apologize. And Flo, maybe you can chime in on this too, as the head of HR at a fully remote company with people around the world. This is also obviously something that you're thinking about a lot, and I know you're working on this too. But from both of you, I wonder if you could just talk a bit about how you see well-being factoring into this future of work that has been sort of accelerated in the post-COVID world, let's say, as you said, Arosha.
Building off of what Arosha was just saying, people are expecting different things from their employers now. Like, why should I have to get in a car and sit in traffic for 2 hours when I can do this work from home? Or why can't I take this time to go and watch my kids play at school? The kind of, again, that flexibility. And I think with well-being also, and following from what happened with COVID, it's like, hey, it's no longer my well-being stays at home and my work self goes to work, and my personal problems don't come to work with me. They don't factor in. I think what we're seeing is that they do. And we are not talking about well-being at work. We're acting like there's two different people, but actually, you're one person, and all of those well-being factors influence how productive you are, how many ideas you have, how well you do your work, how you communicate with other people. And yeah, I think that's a really big part of it.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
It reminds me of that TV show Severance. Someone who has two completely separate brains, basically, the work brain and the life brain. And now, or things are dissolving, I guess. Those walls are dissolving, right?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that's a very interesting show.
Would you
Yeah.
add to that, Arosha?
Yeah.
In the data that you studied, are you seeing that sort of dissolving of boundaries between work and
Oh,
life?
when we first started with Quan 3 years ago, we started with a question, which is what is well-being? I literally woke up one day, what is well-being? And I think it's
Mm-hmm.
important right now. COVID had just happened. Everybody had to stay home. My husband's an emergency worker, so he was working, and I was like, what is well-being? And I called 8 of my friends that day, and I spoke to 4 psychologists, and I got 8 different answers, and I was like, oh my gosh, nobody knows what well-being is. Well, at least we have different variations of it, but is there an actual definition, right? And so we researched it for 8 weeks, and we realized there's more than 200 subdimensions and predictors of well-being, and yet the average person can maybe talk about 5, 10, right?
Mm-hmm.
Aware of potentially 5. um, and when we developed the first framework for well-being, and it is body, mind, meaning, self-fulfillment, social connectedness, and it goes deeper into each of those. We developed the first assessment. And one of the things that we said 3 years ago was we need to ask a set of questions looking at both personal and work life. And the first set of people that we tested this on were healthcare workers,
Interesting.
right?
Interesting.
Because, yeah, go on.
Well, I was going to ask then, so is part of that then there's stuff that people kind of know intuitively, but they don't know how to talk about it. So if you start defining it, then people have this thing that they can actually talk about rather than these sort of vague feelings.
100%. I mean, you cannot do any kind of self-care without some level of self-awareness, right? Um, and and let's take it a notch further. If you go to the doctor and they misdiagnose you, they're going to treat you for the wrong thing. So it starts with knowing first what it is that I need
Right.
to improve. And that is the reason why you need to increase people's understanding of what are all the different things so that they can focus on the right things. Because in most cases, people will say, I'm not sleeping well and they'll download Headspace or Calm or whatever it is, and then they still don't sleep better. But actually, the issue is financial insecurity, right?
Right.
No amount of sleep stories is going to help you sleep better when you're actually worried about your finances. And so that's an example. But what we were talking about, the personal life and work life, what was super interesting is during the time of COVID, one can argue that our healthcare workers were the most important, right? So they had important things to do and they were doing meaningful work, right?
Right.
So
And
we
they were
did
coming
this.
home to cheers and applause every day as well.
Absolutely, the whole world was cheering, and yet the mental health of those people was not very good. And so one can expect: is it because the demands of work? Is it because they're just not sleeping well? Is it because? But we did some assessments, and the results were really interesting for us because some of their most poorest scores came down to social connectedness in their personal life, the giving support to their family, the being there for their children was very, very low. And that they had this, the parents, the people that felt like they had to be home and help support their families, but they couldn't. That juxtaposition was putting a lot of stress. And now you can zoom back and you can think about all those posts, right? Of the surgeons that couldn't touch their
Right.
children,
Right.
but we could see it in the data.
And as those boundaries between work and life dissolve, then you can start approaching the problems honestly, because you don't have to say, well, if it's a work problem, then it's a work problem. It has nothing to do with what's going on in my life. And then you can actually start to ask the right questions. That makes
and
sense.
and you take the assumption out, because then if you were to go, say in this case, you go to work and everyone's talking about, we know that you're all stressed because you're not sleeping well and you're working really hard, but actually they're all sitting there going, I don't spend enough time with my family and I feel
Right.
guilty and I'm worried about that. Perhaps you should spend 30 minutes discussing that, right?
That's
That's what we
very
want.
interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, that's great. Flo, so I'm curious then, with that sort of in mind, as you're approaching a workforce that is quite literally global. How many countries? 40, something like that. More than 40 countries. A
More
lot,
than
right?
30 for sure.
Yeah. Everybody working remotely. How do you approach that as a company-wide way to make sure that you're thinking about people's well-being when you can't walk into the office and see them and have an honest conversation necessarily? How do you think about that?
It's still something we're working on. I think some starting points are just talking about it and bringing it up. And like, when I talk to some of our team leads, for example, asking them, like, how's your health, how's your family, but also, so that they can take that and talk to their team, and just making it an item on the agenda. Something I encourage, and I do in my team as well, is we have time off as part of our agenda every week. We talk about, hey, who's taking vacation, how are we going to cover for each other. If something's important, you have to keep reminding people, keep talking about it, keep bringing it up, and letting people know that it's okay to talk about in certain settings, like personal things or how you're struggling at home, or like it's not going to be perceived as some kind of excuse or not relevant to the work conversation, things like that. I think that's, talking about it is definitely the starting point.
Yeah, it seems like what you're both saying, or what I'm hearing, is that there maybe has historically been a lot of stuff kind of underground there, but not in the open. And once you bring it out in the open and you have names for it and you can talk about it, then you can start actually approaching it in a realistic way, which is really interesting.
You need to support your managers and in creating a space to have those conversations. One of the
Right.
things we found over the last 3 years is there's a real big discrepancy in managers, right? And EQ skills or their ability to do this. And so from a people leader perspective, or from a leadership perspective, we know that the World Economic Forum had stated that emotional intelligence, problem solving, creativity are all skills of the future. By 2030, it's going to be one of the top 3 skills that are needed. in this current environment where you no longer even sit next to someone, you need to up that. So how do you get a pulse and a feeling of how people are? How do you create a space for conversations to happen, where you don't get the benefit of just seeing them and maybe asking them around the corner, right? So that requires some level of training and teaching people how do you create a space for that? How do you create a space where someone can even come up and have this conversation with you, right? And so that's also important.
Well, so in a way, though, the remote environment puts pressure on the need to do that well because you can't rely on any other cues. Like that peek around the corner could be almost a way of not actually engaging, but thinking that you did because you looked around the corner. But if you have to actually deliberately get on a call with someone and talk about a specific topic, you're kind of forcing it to happen in a way. Maybe we can focus on I want to get into some specific areas, particularly around remote work. I want to talk a bit about communication first, if that's okay. So how in this sort of future of work where a lot of people are working remotely, some not, how can communication be done effectively while at the same time sort of respecting work-life balance and promoting well-being? And that's a question to either of you, whoever wants to take it.
I think it's again on the team level, because that's the closest kind of, that's your manager, what they expect of you, that's your colleagues, how you interact. I think teams have to have these deliberate conversations and make agreements with each other and say, hey, we are, everyone's going to have some sacred time on the calendar where their notifications are muted and we all know they're not going to reply. Or, I might message you at midnight your time because of my time zone. You're going to mute so that I don't wake you up, or, because those kind of things happen. And I realize sometimes at Yoda One, like, these things have been happening for months and I didn't even know it. And then I realized that I woke someone up by sending them a message because I wanted them to see it in their morning, and they actually got it at like 3 a.m. And I was like, wait a minute, we need to talk about these things, and, use your status message, use your team meetings, and make some agreements like, hey, when do you need to be online? When are you totally offline? What do we agree on as a team about like how this communication works? It's tough to do for a whole company when you're talking about like over 100 people, but it definitely needs to start in those smaller team units.
100%. And indeed, I'm going to go back to the thing that I said before, which is, first understand and build awareness on what isn't working, where are the issues, and then teach the teams to have a discussion and then come up with, we call it rituals, but ways to improve that particular issue. And then in another, whether it's be 12 weeks as we do, check in again. Is it working? Are things better? I can tell you, being a fully remote team, we're a startup. We're 16 people spread across about 4 countries. What has really helped us is, from a communications perspective, asynchronous communications, reducing meetings, and
reducing meetings.
Reducing these screen time meetings are not good for most people. Replacing, making it normal to do walking meetings. There's just a series of things, right? There's a series.
That's a really interesting one, the walking meetings. To know when you can have a conversation when you're outside on a walk, where you don't have to share your screen, and deliberately knowing what type of meetings can and can't be. Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by rituals? You said that word, and I just want to understand what exactly you mean by that.
We call them rituals, but they're basically like commitments, team commitments, and team ways of working. Rituals are essentially what defines a culture, right? It's what the habits of the team are. So a ritual can be, meetings on Fridays. A ritual can be, 12 to 1 p.m. are blocked out for lunch, and you're not allowed to schedule anything. And what we're saying is a team should have conscious rituals. and those rituals should be guided by some level of data on what is working and what's not. And so you should constantly refresh based on where the team's at, right? It's a living, breathing, dynamic group. And so just like you might have very clear metrics on what we need to achieve at the end of this quarter, say, you should also be looking at, and how did we achieve it? Were we doing this well? Were there things that weren't working so well? And what should we do differently in the coming quarter? Because if you don't keep abreast of that, then there may be the most engaged, the most hardworking team members that the performance is coming at a cost of their well-being, and it's not sustainable.
And so there's a long-term cost to that, which is negative. So you're saying, a KPI for a team may be well and good and necessary, but if there's not a qualitative conversation around those KPIs, then you could be heading toward a brick wall in terms of well-being. That makes a lot of sense to me. Because there are a lot of, when you have a KPI coming up, there are a lot of internal things that happen that you don't necessarily share, and you don't necessarily even acknowledge consciously, but you realize there's stuff going, there are wheels turning in the back of your head, and those aren't all healthy wheels.
Yeah, exactly. And the truth is that when you look at high performance, right, whether it's an athlete or actually a business team, high performing teams have got recovery on prioritization of well-being inbuilt.
Well, we need an ice bath, Flo. I want an ice bath budget. That's what I want.
Do a Wim Hof retreat like Flo did.
A nice bath might work for you, but Flo might just need afternoon of no meetings, and that'll be good enough. So again, teach the team to have a discussion on what's best for us, right?
Right. Flo, I wonder. So you said the rituals are part of what make culture, right? So I think this question of connecting to the culture is interesting. Again, particularly if Arosha, and you said your team is working remotely as well. The culture is this kind of nebulous thing that is made up of a set of principles, ways of working, maybe a communication style, maybe things that we've identified as important. Maybe Flo, you could speak to this first about how you can connect to and sort of interact within that culture space so that you're continuing to add to the culture rather than drifting away from it.
That's a good question. I think one of the things we like at Yoda One, we have a lot of documentation about our culture, and anyone who's interviewing with us, and especially once they join, they're going to spend the first bit of time reading guides, watching videos about how our culture works. But of course, that doesn't mean anything if when they actually get into things, they don't see it and experience it. So that's, it's that constant, something has to be top of mind, constantly communicated, happening everywhere. We have that, I think, in our culture as well. And then you notice how when new people come in and they maybe have their own twist or own approach, how flexible are we? How much do we want to maintain the culture? How much wiggle room is there? Yeah, I guess when you talk about connecting to the culture, it's understanding why it matters. Obviously it can't just be some arbitrary, we do this or we do that. And then being able to see that people around you are doing it and then find your own way of doing it as well, making it your own. And I guess that's what we aim for in our onboarding, for example, with something like Sunshine. Understand why it's important, get into groups and teams and see that it's happening all around you, and then find your own way of, your style of sunshining, as we like to say.
Right. Yeah. Well said.
One of ours is strive to respond and not react. And, that is really core to well-being. And it is about self-awareness and things. So yeah, it's very, very.
Can you speak to that? What is the difference between respond and react? I think I know in my head, but I'm curious.
Responding is taking that moment. So we're very science-based, right? So we have a lot of PhDs, a lot of science. We like fact, we like reason, and we like to give space for people to contemplate and think. We value that before you just shoot something out, on one hand, right? And on the other hand is reaction is often coming from a place of pressure. And so we basically are like, there are some situations where you need to move quickly. And there are other situations where you don't need to put pressure on. You can actually give
Right.
it a bit of time. And then you give time for a better reflection and a better response. And so those are the two angles underpinning what that means.
That's very interesting. I like that framing of it. I also wanted to ask about, this is sort of connected to back to the overall sort of strategies for working remotely. I don't know if any data supports this, Arosha, but when you are working remotely, the way that you connect with the world can change a little bit. Where before, being out a lot, that back and forth, just being connected to other humans. I know that people deal with feelings of, I'm home all the time now, a lot more than before. I feel a little bit isolated. I feel like I lack connection. How do you approach that? First of all, I'm wondering if the data supports that, or if that's just my sense of it. And how would you recommend organizations deal with that sort of isolation or feeling of disconnectedness?
Interesting. The data actually showed that social connectedness, at least from our data set last year, those that had worked, the year before, those that had just started with Quan. Quan was very, very new then, but
Right.
social connectedness was actually one of the highest scoring. And that was because we hypothesized on why, and that is like appreciation, belonging, giving and receiving support. And it was giving support was very high. And so we're wondering if that during that time, people sort of overcompensated, that they couldn't see someone, so that they were actively connecting and seeing how people were. We hypothesized, right? But as you go into this kind of world of sitting behind a screen, what we are seeing is, and the research supports things like having regular check-ins, having the importance of a manager one-on-one, where it's not about your to-do list, but asking, questions around. What I do with my team is, how are you? What's giving you energy? What's draining your energy? This is the three questions, and those are the only things we
Those are
talk
great
about.
questions. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm
I
going to write
stole
those
that
down.
from
Yeah. So
I stole that from you, and I shared it in our managers group, and I've been asking my team as well, and it's great. It's really simple, really effective,
simple and really valuable, and it allows you to track. Because if they're saying the same thing, a few weeks in a row, you're like, okay, why is that not being addressed? This could become an issue, right? And then the importance of community, that cannot be emphasized enough. Sub-communities, creating space for groups to connect on various topics about work, outside of work. Our most busiest channel in Slack is the random channel, right? Where lots of things are shared, and it's that feeling of connectivity, right? And so those are the things, and co-working space opportunities. For those of us that are extroverts that do need the in-person, if you know that there are some people that are in a city, create the opportunity for them to co-work together. That can mean a lot for them. And those are so you can see like concrete ways that you can help on the topic of what we're talking about here is social connectedness.
So that's interesting. There's no single solution, but approaching it from a lot of different angles
I'll
seems to
always
be the
go
way to
back
go.
to I always go back to find out what's important for the team, and then come up with a ritual that's important for the team.
I love that framework of, the question is, how are you doing? What's draining you and what's giving you energy, right?
Yeah.
Those are great. Flo, what are you doing? I know there are obviously a lot of social events happening at Yoda One, and people are doing things all the time. Is this stuff that you're building around that idea of just making sure that people feel like they can be plugged in? How are you putting it into practice?
Oh, well, it's again, there's no one size fits all. What we're trying to do is give a variety of options. As Arosha said, some people just really want to have people around them physically to work with. And that's the kind of thing that some people have done is they've found ways to work with other people, even if they don't have any colleagues nearby. Just earlier today, actually, we hosted an internal pitch club, which is something that Yoda One's been doing for 4 years now. And it's kind of an environment where people, they're learning, they're improving, they're challenging themselves. But I've also found it, like when I first started joining Yoda One, Pitch Club was where I went to socialize, like see other people, hear their ideas, meet new faces, because I was a freelancer then. I rarely joined calls or saw people or really knew who they were. And today we had one of our newer team members who's based in Montenegro talking about how he'd kind of always been working remotely, felt a little lonely, a little isolated, and he took the initiative to create a local gaming community.
Nice.
And he kind of walked us through the little steps that he took one by one to recently they had an event with, I think, 400 or 500 people. And it's really an inspirational story. I think that's the kind of thing we want to encourage people as well. You can find communities. For me, being until recently the only person in Holland, going to some of the Quan events or communities or other HR related things here in the neighborhood. Like just knowing that there's options and being encouraged, seeing stories of other people doing it and being like, hey, I can go out. I don't have to stay at home. I don't have to work alone. I can find communities related to work or unrelated to work. And just kind of encouraging and highlighting those things. I think that's something we're doing right now.
That's great. Well, those are the main things I wanted to cover today. I appreciate it. A very interesting conversation. I look forward to hopefully having future ones. And Flo and Arosha, thank you both so much.